السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على محمد النبي الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Today, inshallah, we are starting a new sunnah, I guess, or chapter in the Islam 201, which is a continuing. We started with the Muwafaqat al-Shatibi, but now we're going to make it, inshallah, more regular, that once a month we will cover a book. And tonight, it's not really a book that Sheikh Muhammad Rashid Rida wrote. It's a collection of his writings in Al-Manar, which was a magazine that he established in Egypt. As a background, Sheikh Muhammad Rashid Rida, or the Allama Muhammad Rashid Rida, was born in Lebanon in 1865, which was a turbulent period in Lebanon at the time when the war drew between the Druze and the Maronites, and the French and the British Navy came to Lebanon and forced a new reality in there. He studied with many of the scholars, and then he moved to Egypt to be close to another sheikh of the time, Muhammad Abdo. We have not covered neither of them in our discussion, but when you read about their lives, you will find a mix, especially Muhammad Abdo and Jamaluddin Afghani, to a less extent Muhammad Rashid Rida. He had books. The Tafsir of Al-Manar is one of them. Al-Khilafa is another book. Al-Hayat Zawjiyya, the marriage life, is another book. And this one is called Shubuhat al-Nasara wa Hujaj al-Islam. And inshallah, Brother Hassan will talk about this English translation of the book, but it's available on the internet, both in Arabic and in English. Brother Hassan, Bismillah.
Yes. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, wa man tabi'a bi ihsanin ila yawm ad-din. Yeah, so it's available in English. Anybody wants to read it? It's the way the English version, at least this translation, is that about 1/4 is actually just an analysis of it, and then he translates after that. So it's kind of different. I think, first of all, as Brother Hisham said, we're going to, inshallah, do once a month book review. So if you have a book that you have in mind you want us to cover, let me know, and Brother Hisham know, inshallah. But I have my own ideas as well. So, but if there's something in particular you think it's useful, we're definitely open to suggestions. So first I wanted to set the stage. As Brother Hisham said, Sheikh Sayyid Muhammad Rashid Rida, he's from Lebanon. He was born a little bit south of Tripoli, Trablus, and from a Sunni area of Lebanon, basically. He grew up and he attended Quttab school, the traditional Islamic learning for young people in particular. And then he attended a school was established by Sheikh Hussein al-Jisr, and it's before I even get to that, if you think about it, he was born 1865, and he died in 1935. So the timing is important, because the timing, when we think about it, that time period, it was obvious to the people the Muslims living at that time, that the Islamic influence was very weak. In fact, they could tell it's being attacked from every direction. And also, they could see that there was something new on the horizon that came, namely the French Revolution and the French Constitution. Because this is, of all the constitutions and revolutions, really that one set the stage for all of the modern, formation of republics. In fact, it was the one that inspired the most, intellectual exercise behind like understanding what was this thing and how do we respond to it. And so, in fact, many of the scholars they saw it as, especially Sheikh Muhammad Abduh, he saw it as a version of Islam that was born in the West, meaning that he thought that this is what Islam should be like. Unfortunately, it's in the wrong clothes, in Western clothes, but this is the way they thought about it. And in fact, they had the twin task of defending Islam against secularist ideas, but also against a lot of Christian missionaries, because Christian missionaries were widespread. They were attacking Islam and in a very systematic way and had been doing it for a long time. So in that context, this kind of work, which is defending Islam against Christian missionary attacks, is not that new. They weren't the first to engage in it. In fact, there was a book which I learned of while reading this book. It is called Risala al-Hamidiyya. I don't know if you're familiar with this. No, Sheikh Hussein Jisr. But it's before Sheikh Rashid Rida. And also there is a book. I'm missing it here. I'm going to. Sorry, I'm trying to use this new PowerPoint in my, but I'm now going forward constantly. It's not going backwards. So this is the problem with technology. Qayrawi, he wrote this book called Idhar al-Haq. And it was written in response to a Christian missionary, Karl Fander. And then there was another book called As-Sayf, and I'm not sure the word, because it's in English, As-Saqil, a polished sword. Saqil. Yeah, see, this is why we have school. Yeah, so the polished sword. These were two books that were written side by side. They were in response to Christian missionaries. So he would have known about these books, in the context of writing this. So what was Al-Manar? Al-Manar al-Islami was basically a journal, and it was sent all throughout the whole Muslim world. What was this book that we're covering? It is a series of 16 articles written in response to Christian missionaries, basically, and their criticisms. And he later collected it. Actually, Sheikh Rashid Rida also did collect this into a book, but because they found it to be of benefit. In fact, Tafsir al-Manar is also from the same thing, because it came published in al-Manar, the Tafsir, and then they later finished. I think they did about 12 juz of the Tafsir before Rashid Rida passed away, and that was the end of his efforts. Anyway, so you need to understand that, because number one, this is going to be somewhat disjointed, and it's natural because it's not written as like one single book all the way through. It's a series of responses to certain criticisms. So naturally, when we talk about it, it's going to be a little bit, this criticism, that criticism, that criticism. But there is some kind of central theme as well. One thing just before we get started, and this is what the Sheikh, he mentioned it over and over again in responding to these criticisms. He said, I really did not want to respond to these people, but they kept insisting, meaning the Christian missionaries. They would keep sending him letters. They would keep badgering him. The Muslims also would say, you need to respond to this. And so he said, eventually I decided I should do some response. And he said that, but the point of response, why he was hesitant, he said, we don't want to insult them and they insult us, and then in the process everybody is insulting each other. He says, we want friendship and good relationships with each other, not this kind of competition. But anyway, that was his point of view. But eventually he did write these responses. So I'll just get to it because there's 16 of these, and some of these are short, some of these may be a bit longer. I didn't go through all 16. There are some of his points which, I didn't find that strong, or some of them were very complicated, so, very hard to present in a small time. So I kind of tried to keep it to the things that are most easy to digest. So article number 1 that he started, he said there was these criticisms, and he talked over the course of several articles about this. One, he said there's the Christian missionaries, they criticized Islamic texts because they are not, there's contradictions between them and the texts of the Jews and the Christians. In other words, our texts are older, your new text is contradicting, that means your text, has some defects in it. This is the basic criticism. Or there are things in the Quran that are not mentioned in our books, meaning our older books. So, why is it has new things? Or there are things in the Quran and the Hadith that contradict reality or what is established by modern sciences. And, this is a point which, frankly, is regurgitated nowadays in different settings. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this book in particular is that every kind of criticism you find that he responds to, you'll find every day somebody is challenging that same point on Twitter today. I mean, it's as if they forgot all these debates that they had, because they keep regurgitating the same points. People keep defending against the same points, but it's not a new criticism, because these are things that ever since there was this active engagement between the Near West and the Near East of Christendom and Islam, they constantly had the same kinds of debates. So anyway, moving on to the first point, the contradiction between Islamic texts and Jewish scripture. So they said that the Quran says in Surah 5, verse 44, "Inna anzalna at-Tawrah hudan wa nur." Indeed, we sent down the Torah, and in there is a guidance, there's a huda, right? So they're saying, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that Torah has guidance. How are you to reject the Torah? So this is what they ask, this basic question. The Quran is testifying to the Torah. And what the response of the Shaykh Rida is that the Quran says about the Torah as a book of law. He says what you guys have is a book of law, it's mixed with a lot of history, and we don't really know who wrote this history book. It's unattested. In fact, there are portions which could be true and part of the original Torah, which was part of that book of law, and there's portions which we definitely know were not part of it. And in fact, he talks about this book of errors, because he says in book of Genesis, it says, Lord said to the snake, this is in Genesis, he said, Lord said to the snake, you are dust, you shall eat dust all the days of your life, telling the snake. And he said, the snake does not eat dust. That's a basic point. He said, this is an irrational thing that's in this book. And he said it's full of these kinds of illogical errors. Why? Not because it's from Allah and it has errors, but because people wrote this book much later and they put in things of this nature. Furthermore, it has unbefitting characteristics of God, where, for example, they have in the same, I think, Genesis, they said God, when he created mankind, he regretted creating mankind. He said, I wish I hadn't created mankind. So he said, what is this about, God is going to regret what he did as if he doesn't have all wisdom and all knowledge? This is what he's saying, that this is a kind of thing that a man would have put in a book, but it would have no place that if it was actually a divine text to be put in there. And so he said, the problem is that we cannot know what is true and what is not true. We have no way of authenticating, what is the truth and what is not the truth. So, and that is why, if there's a contradiction, he said that basically, why are you going to say that if there's a contradiction, we need to go to the Torah, something which you cannot attest to its veracity. You cannot attest that it's true. And in fact, it has all these errors in it, logical errors and frankly, defamatory things that they say about God in it. So why are you going to hold that to a higher standard against which you verify which is correct? In fact, he said the Quran is more attested. We have it correctly since the time of the Prophet ﷺ in its text, in oral transition, and also in its meaning. All of the three different ways we have it verified. So shouldn't you return yourself to the one that is superior in its authenticity versus the one that is not superior? So that was one of the points. He did think that part of the Torah that's today could be from the original Torah, and he said that Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus, these are books in the Old Testament. He said these are books of law, and he said that these most likely may be from the original Torah, and that's what's left of that. Yes, sorry. So one other thing that he said about the authenticity was that that one of the problems with the authenticity of both the Bible and the Old Testament is that from the very moment that it was revealed, the people who carried it were very much oppressed, meaning that for almost 300 years after the Bible was revealed, the Christians were very few. And in fact, they lived in a very oppressive state. And so they didn't have really an opportunity to have a way to carry the message in a consistent way. And the same thing happened to the Jews. And he said the other thing about the Quran is that we have the chain of narration regarding both the Quran and the Hadith. So the sanad ruwat, that we have a science behind authentication that you guys do not have. So he argued also, comparing the different religions in whether they achieve the goal of religion in general. Like, let's say you have a religion, what are the goals of a religion? And he said one of the goals is confirmation of belief. And he said that Islam states that belief has to be confirmed by proof, meaning you have to have an intellectual proof that confirms what you believe. And he said that Christians believe that faith is above reason, meaning you believe without any reasoning. And he said that Jews believe in absurdities, meaning that they say, for example, the same text in Genesis that was, Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on earth, and it grieved him to his heart. This is what they claim that God said. And then he also claims that God said, Lord, he said, I will blot out from earth the human beings I have created. Which he says they both say God is, astaghfirullah, ignorant. He didn't know what was happened, and he's incapable. Because he's saying he's going to blot out humans from the earth, na'udhu billah, but he doesn't do it. So he's incapable of doing it. So this is what he's saying, that the Jews believe in their faith absurdities. So he's saying that this, if you compare the three, and you bring them to the modern era, a thinking person in modernity, which faith is superior? He said you would definitely believe that Islam is the superior faith because we believe in rational proof and reasoning to establish faith. The other one, he says, is that another goal of religion is confirmation of morals. And he says that Islam believes in justice and moderation, but he said Christianity is built on extremes. He says, for example, they say, love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you. And he gave another example from the Bible. He says that this is what is claimed that Jesus said. He said, whoever comes to me and does not hate his father, his mother, his wife, children, brothers, and even life cannot be my disciple. Meaning he has to hate all these people. This is kind of extremism. And then in another verse he says, as for the enemies of mine, bring them here and slaughter them in my presence. So there's kind of extreme kind of statements. And he said that Islam in terms of morals was very balanced. It always balanced this view of justice and moderation. So if you compare the two, meaning Christianity and Islam, you will find a much more superior in the term of morality. And then he said in terms of good acts, There should be good acts that you do that elevate humans bodily and spiritually. And he said, in Islam, we have prayer, which negates lewdness. We have fasting, which leads to taqwa. We have worship, which is done for the pleasure of Allah. So they're kind of things that are natural. And you do these good deeds, they lead to natural improvement in your spiritual well-being. But he said in Christianity, worship is strangely tied to strange things. So for example, he said in the Bible, it says, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. But then it doesn't say anything about bearing false witness against other people. In fact, and he said, compare that to the Quran, where it says, what can be translated as, O believers, stand for justice as witnesses for Allah, even if it is against yourselves, your parents, or your close relatives. So Islam makes an affirmative statement about standing for justice, but the Bible says some, random comment about one particular, situation. And then he talked about, there's another verse in the Bible which says, keep the statutes, meaning the statutes of this king, which I am commanding you for your own well-being and that of your descendants after you. In other words, all the things that are mentioned in the Bible as far as doing good things, they don't have this natural connection to making you closer to Allah. They talk about some random benefit that you might accrue, but it doesn't have an overall arching view of morality, where you do these good deeds, you gain taqwa, you do prayer, it prevents you from lewdness, you do good deeds and it elevates you and makes you closer to Allah. These kinds of natural things, which the Quran mentions over and over again, the Bible you'll find scattered things about good deeds, and they'll relate to maybe a worldly benefit, and they don't really have a kind of paradigm of morality in the same way. Furthermore, he said, Christianity is incompatible with science, reasoning, and progress. And the reason he gave for that was that he said the peak of Christian worship, meaning when Christianity was at its height, was also the peak of the Dark Ages. Yeah. So, in other words, when your religion was the most adherent and it was advancing at the highest speed, it also was the time of intellectual decline. And he said only by exposure to Islam, meaning the European societies got exposed to Islam, and they rejected Christianity, meaning as a paradigm by which they should rule themselves. In other words, that's what the French Constitution is. It rejects Christianity as a paradigm for ruling. It makes a secular constitution. And it says we can never get ahead by having Christianity as our doctrine for rule. So in other words, he says Christianity is incompatible with science, reasoning, and progress. But he said, on the other hand, Islam, the peak of Islam, was also the peak of scientific progress and development in the Muslim world. And he said that we don't have the same conflict between deen and intellect. And he said, in fact, the Quran talks so much about elevating the intellect and about reasoning, human reasoning. And so that the criticisms which emanate from Europe against religion and reason do not apply to Islam, but they do apply to Christianity. So he said, you are falsely lumping us in with your own intellectual problems. All right, so continuing on some of this, some of these may be a little bit more random. And anybody has any questions, please do ask. Go ahead.
He kept in the book in many places saying that, let's not attack each other religion, let's try. Was he concerned about the Christians among the Muslims that he did not want to? Because all his life seems, or the bulk of the production where he produced was under colonial rule. So why he would keep saying, let's not attack each other? And you start by saying he tried to avoid writing about this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know he had a close friend who was Christian that also followed him from Lebanon to Egypt. But I think the thing that was that they, sorry, I don't know if everybody heard that, but Brother Hisham was asking, why did he why was he so concerned about not causing a conflict between Islam and Muslim and Christians? But the other thing is that I think they really did look up to France and Europe for the new system of progress that they saw. And in fact, that's what Sheikh Muhammad Abdul said. He said, in Europe we find Muslims without Islam, and in Egypt I find, in Europe I find Islam without Muslims, and in Egypt I find Muslims without Islam. So he kind of saw that the system, they did look up to it, and they wanted to create this kind of relationship where they both, benefited. So I don't think his interest was really in polemics. This polemics got tossed onto him, but I don't think he was that interested in it. I don't know if that's what your analysis of it, but
Yeah, I mean that's part of it. I thought it might have been related to the Christians within the Muslim world, because at that point, if you remember, the colonialists tried to attract the Christians in Egypt, the Christians in Lebanon, the Christians and the Alawis, the Kuffar Alawis in Syria. So I thought, I do not want to make the situation worse.
Right,
but what
right.
you're saying make much more sense. Okay.
yeah, well, I mean, some of these books that he's responding to are written by Christians, Arab Christians. Yeah, I mean, these are Arab Christians coming up to him and demanding, that he, respond to their books, So, frankly, they were, and the reason why they were so bold, it's very clear. They had the political support of the superpowers, and the same reason they have today. They have the political support of the superpowers, they have the financial support, and then they have unlimited, protection. They have a higher, almost higher citizenship than the Muslim does. If they get attacked, there's an international incident. Muslims die in the hundreds, thousands, nobody cares. So, in fact, he said that missionaries, you're so supported in your efforts, but you're so failures in what you're doing. This is what he brought up. Yeah. Imam in Paris. Yeah, I'm not familiar with. Is it who wrote that book? Is it?
Imam Ibn Badis.
Oh, Ibn Badis. Oh, Ibn Badis. Is that what you're talking about?
Ibn Badis.
You're talking about. You're saying Imam Ibn in Paris or Ibn? Oh, this book. I mean, I'm not familiar. Yeah. I mean, there were frankly a lot of Muslims that went to France at that time, and
Malik ibn Nabi.
yeah.
So that was also in France.
Yeah.
Tahtawi went but those Azharis who went, unfortunately, from Egypt, Muhammad Ali encouraged them, and his children encouraged them to go to Paris, and they came up with different faces.
Oh, Tantawi, yeah.
Rafa'
Tantawi, okay, yes. So another claim was that Christians telling Muslims they need to follow the Torah and the Gospel, according to, again, sort of Ma'idah 13 and 14. And he said in response, he said that what they're telling us to follow, and the Quran is telling us to follow, is a book that doesn't exist. Meaning that if the Quran tells us to follow the Torah and the Gospel, it's a historical that was released, back at the time of those messengers. But what we have today is we cannot authenticate it. But also he said, why are you, meaning Christians, telling us to follow the Old Testament when you guys do not follow it at all? In fact, part of your belief is you don't follow any of those texts. And so he said, if you're so interested in it, you should start following it first. And so that's that was one of his responses. And so he did talk about. So one of the Christian criticisms was that look how we have a missionary religion and how we have so many missionaries. That must mean that's a true faith because of all these missionaries. And he said that Christianity spread mostly through compulsion and coercion. I mean, this is the reality. You had 300 years to spread Christianity after the death of Isa alayhi salam, and it didn't go anywhere. And in fact, only when the Romans adopted it and coerced people into adopting it, then it became a widespread religion. And he said the same thing happened.
Isa was raised.
Oh, sorry, Isa was raised. Sorry, but it's good. But after the end of that period, but So what happened, so he said that this has always been the case with Christianity. It's always been a coercive way of forcing people into accepting it. He said, on the other hand, we had Muslim traders that would go to nations in Africa and Southeast Asia, and the whole nation would become Muslim just by a few traders that went to visit them. And he said, if you want to compare missionaryism, then you would have to definitely give Islam the edge in that regard. And he said, if missionaryism is a metric by which you measure any truth, he said, then the Baha'is do the most missionary work, but nobody accepts them as saying something true, or other cults of that nature. So it's not really a good or logical argument. And also he said that modern people have doubts. They say, why did God only send religion to the people of Bani Israel? You have this Old Testament, New Testament, they all were sent to the Jews. Why is it that there's a whole world and God only sent a message just to one people? What did the Chinese do wrong, or the Indians, or so forth? And he said Islam had a better answer, because the Quran says that there is no community but a warner was sent to it. And so he said, we believe, Muslims, a belief which is more compatible with modernity. Because after all, he's saying, who is more compatible with modernity? He said, we are, because we believe that every nation had a warner, and that it's more just that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent a warner to every people rather than just to a location and so forth. So, so this was just an odd comment he made, but I thought it reflected some of his viewpoint. He said that Europeans in good morals are closest to the religion of Islam. And this is something he wrote very specifically. It was a kind of random comment, but it does say to us what he was thinking, that he liked these aspects of Europe, and he said that these morals which he appreciated were self-dignity, high motivation, seriousness in work, trustworthiness, universal laws, and they're guided by rationality, meaning they're guided by reason. He said this kind of values that the new Europeans have stuck by is more closer to Islam than Christianity, and is something that we need to really cooperate in. In fact, many people criticize Muslim communities because we have a lot of laziness. We have a lot, in the traditional Muslim, very much backwardness. There's a lot of the things that are in Islam which people are not following. He also said, if these books are divine, they have made God like a human being. So he said, in fact, there's a verse in the Bible where it says, Israel wrestled with God and threw him down. Thanks be to Israel. This is a verse that they say that Israel, of course, is Yaqub alayhi salam. But they believe that he wrestled, this is in the Bible. But also, more than this, he said that they have committed slander against all the prophets. So for example, it says that they say that Daud alayhi salam committed adultery. Lut alayhi salam committed adultery with his daughter. Nuh committed adultery. Sulaiman alayhi salam, he worshipped idols. All of these things are in the Old Testament, and he said, if these books are divine, then they made the whole thing a joke. So this is another kind of criticism he had. And he wrote, as one Christian wrote, it is impossible that the original copy of Moses' book survived until the present day. We don't know what happened to it. He said, it's more likely possibility it was lost with the ark when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple. So in fact, the Jews and the Christians, they agree. This book that Musa alayhi salam, he had, we don't have it. It was destroyed. But they say that Ezra came later as a scribe, and he reconstituted the Torah, and he actually improved it and updated it, in fact. And so they said he was a scholar of Torah, and then that's what he did. But that's definitely from their own history. They claim that they don't have the original book. In fact, that it was destroyed. He talked about the issue of faith and action. Christians claim that faith is sufficient for salvation. And they talk about this over and over again. So even the most wicked person is saved by faith alone. So of course in Islam we do have this belief that if you become Muslim, that eventually, even if you have very little in terms of good deeds, that you will enter into Jannah as long as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts your faith. But the point of it is that in Islam, this is not like mentioned over and over again. In fact, most of the time, faith is mentioned with action. Because faith necessitates good action. And so Islam feeds this to Muslims over and over again, this combination between these two things. And also Islam balances this natural hope in Allah and fear. And so it has this balance between these two emotions. You fear that the wrath of Allah, you hope for the mercy of Allah. So these are natural kinds of ways to look at God. He said, on the other hand, the Christians have kind of an illogical thing that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. First of all, they want you to believe in something illogical. That 3 is equal to 1. So what he said this in very simple terms. He said that they believe God is composed of 3 elements, each identical to each other, and they become one. One of the 3 is God. He's incarnate in a human body. Then this human being became God. Then the Son of God, a human being, and then the son of a human being becomes God. All of these things they're claiming. He said this kind of belief is illogical. And then he said that he, meaning God, empowered his enemies over him so that they might be crucifying him. And then he bore the pain and divine curse in order to save people from the sin of their father Adam and also their own sins, because he found no other way to give them salvation other than this very roundabout, complicated way that he needs to give salvation. He said, compare this to what Islam has come with. The very basic message: believe, do good deeds, have faith, fear Allah, have hope in Allah's mercy. He said, what is more compatible with modernity and reason, what Islam came with or what you came with? He said, you're asking the modern person to believe something totally illogical and totally, hard to swallow as a modern reasoning person. And he said, in fact, when you ask people to believe something so illogical, he said, all this does is motivate them to encourage them to do sins. They keep doing sins because their basis for their faith is not solid. And he said, the ignorant person, he said, would love to commit every sin, and he only needs to be saved by saying one, profession, just saying something about Jesus, and you can do every sin that you want. He said, this is what the ignorant person would love to do. And he said, that's why Islam has the opposite approach. It constantly talks about faith and doing good deeds. And he said there's a quote from a Christian who said that every faith that does not have perfection as its objective, piety as its benefit, is either a false faith in a true God or it's a true faith in a false God. And he said, indeed, what you're talking about is you think that's a description of Christianity, but in fact that's a description of Islam, because Islam has these two qualities of perfection and piety, and in fact you have a much more distorted view of religion. So there was, how much more time do we have? We have half an hour. Okay, good. I was losing track of time. So there is so he not only responded to Christian complaints, but he also responded to some secular Muslim complaints. And actually, this was now that I'm sorry, I think back, there's a book, or I'm not sure if it's a book. It's Al-Jamia by Antun. He's a Christian. I think he's a secular Arab, but I think he originally Christian. Anyway. He wrote a series of criticism about Islam. He said that Islam is like paganism. This is what he was saying. And why? And we'll go into the points why and the responses. He said that you have included Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Shahada, and that is a form of polytheism. Yeah, astaghfirullah. But in fact, I just saw this on Twitter like a few weeks ago. Somebody said the same exact thing. So, these things are regurgitated, frankly. And he said that we acknowledge Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as his servant and messenger. We don't. Everybody knows that we are not combining them as worship in terms of as a god. And he said, is it monotheism to equate Moses and Pharaoh? You know, he said, are you going to equate everybody as the same? In other words, when we elevate somebody, we elevate them for a good reason. And the Prophet ﷺ is elevated because of his status as a messenger, and also how he was revealed, the Quran was revealed to him. So that's why he has that position in the Shahada. You said, and they say that you gave hadith the status of the Quran. But he said, in fact, Quran is the basis of religion and Sunnah elaborates it. And he said that the rejection of a single narration, khabar ahad, hadith, does not constitute unbelief. This is a position of Ahl Sunnah. That if you reject a single narration, hadith, it doesn't have the same level of authentication as the Quran and does not constitute kufr. Okay. Yeah. I mean, he also said that you talk about another reason why you can have Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned with Allah is that the Quran came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so when it's revealed through a cause being the events being attributed to the cause is sound, meaning that you can say if something came, Microsoft brought you Windows, then you can say that Microsoft is Windows. In other words, you're not saying that Microsoft is Windows, but you're saying that it's because the event, the cause and effect can be naturally connected in people's minds, and as a way of shorthand or way of talking about things. It doesn't mean what you think it means.
Why he would say it's a form of polytheism when if a person just say La ilaha illallah, there are so many people around the world that say there's one God. I mean, the Muhammad Rasulullah is the basis for the faith itself in this regard, because believing Allah is something that people can reach to it by thinking about all this creation, but at the end, what does Allah wants from us? I mean, that's where the risala comes. So I do not see where, what's the argument of that this is a form of polytheism, since no Muslim would associate the entity of the Prophet Muhammad in any way with the godly characteristics.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so I think, of course, no Muslim would. I think this is a kind of like a superficial criticism. The people are from a Christian who's saying, well, you say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. You combine the two together. In fact, there was there's even hadith, there's من يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما ومن يعصيهما. Some people say when من يعصيهما, you combine the two people together, right? And so there's a criticism even internally, Islamically, about the idea of combining the Prophet ﷺ and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala too closely connected. You need to have some natural separation.
Yeah. Objected to
So that this is a natural objection the Prophet ﷺ made to this statement that whoever disobeys Allah, somebody made the connection, whoever, he used the Arabic term for duality between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, no, disconnect them into separate statements, not to connect them together.
I guess you answered a question that there's a sister who was born as a Muslim in an Arab country.
Yeah.
She came and wasted an hour of my time saying, why not enough that we say La ilaha illallah?
Yeah.
I said, what bothers you with Muhammad Rasulullah? And it seemed that she read some of this on Twitter and it just got her.
It got her in mind, yeah. And also, I mean, yes. So also the Shahada in its current form is in Bukhari and Muslim and multiple ahadith. It's very well authenticated. But there has been some dispute over time about the exact wording of the Shahada. I mean, some people, how. But that's neither here nor there. I think it's the point which people get stuck on, is they're feeding from a point of view of a Christian criticism, not really a rational view of what Islam is. They just picked up this criticism from somewhere else. And
I don't want to drag, but I mean,
Yeah.
that he's talking about, since there are 3 in 1 and 1 in 3,
Yeah.
that the shahada
is a kind of
2 in
like,
1 and
yeah,
1 in
yeah,
2?
exactly.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so he's saying that you are also saying something similar. He's trying to drag us into their kind of quagmire that they put themselves in. So there was another claim. He said that some Muslims claim that Muhammad is pre-existent, or there's something called Nur al-Muhammadi. Have you heard of this?
I've heard of the masjid.
And so there is a Sufi kind of, some Sufis have this belief, and in fact they call Insan al-Kamil, the perfect human being, and that the Prophet ﷺ existed before time, and that he didn't, he was always there, and so they said, you guys believe this, and he's saying, well, in fact, this is not from Quran or sound hadith or anything like that. Some people, if they bring this, they don't have any evidence for it. So, so if you ever hear this kind of state, I mean, I didn't know about this.
You hear these.
Yeah. And then he said, you say about the Prophet ﷺ, you said Sayyidina. You said he's our master. and he said that, in fact, the scholars said there's no, they didn't have any agreement on this, whether or not you should say this or not. He said some scholars considered it reprehensible, some scholars considered it commendable, but most agreed that it is a form of respect to say to somebody, anybody, and it more applies to the Prophet ﷺ. As fact, he said that the prophets in general are superior to all the creations of human beings. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is superior to all the prophets. So, it's a sign of respect to use this word. It has nothing to do with his godly nature or not. But this is, again, another criticism. Not sure if you heard this.
Sayyidina Umar used to say about
Yeah.
Sayyidina Bilal
Yeah.
and Sayyidina Abu Bakr, Sayyidina wa ataqa Sayyidina.
Yeah.
He will call Abu Bakr Sayyidina and he will call Bilal Sayyidina.
Yeah.
But it looks like, as you just mentioned, that they are looking at any tiny thing that can be, a source of argument.
Yeah, so you'll see that also. Some people claim this is another thing that we're doing that's creating a kind of shirk or some kind of paganism. Another thing they say that Muhammad as an intercessor is a form of pre-Islamic pagan belief, meaning that shafa'a, is kind of something that you're kind of following paganism. In fact, his response was, intercession is kind of like a dua. It's a call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said that every person can be an intercessor in that sense, meaning you can all make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, is it paganism that you make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives your father? This is not paganism. In fact, this has nothing to do with paganism. It's just a standard form of dua. And he said it's a foolish thing that you charge Muslims with, because you believe your prophet is God, pre-existent, eternal, creator, and an intermediary between God and God. He's like God and he's intermediator between God. So he said, you believe all these irrational things, and you're nitpicking on these small points that don't make any sense. So again, you're right. This is what he was saying, that basically you're nitpicking about very random small things that are easily explained. But again, I think they're trying to drag Muslims down into some of the problems that they created for themselves. I think we'll end with one topic. This is now from Al-Jami'a, from Farah Al-Tun. He is a secular Christian Arab, but he was, I think, his friend. He moved from Lebanon to Egypt with him for whatever reason. So he said there are three things that, and these three things, frankly, at least two of them you probably have heard, because people bring these points up over and over again. One is that Islam is the enemy of reason. Two, that Islam denied cause and effect. And three, that combining religious and civil authority together, such as with a Khalifa, harms Muslims. So in other words, we need to separate. It's rather a call for secularism. And he said their aim in these three comments is to divorce religion from reason. So you're saying Islam is the enemy of reason, but in fact what they're trying to do is saying that you can't be a rational person and believe in Islam. And he said the other thing they're trying to do is this is going to be a little bit of a tricky philosophical point. They're saying they make you believe in cause and effect. And the third, they want to make the ruler a secular leader. The cause and effect part is a philosophical thing, but we'll talk about it at the end. It's more tricky than a simple explanation. Oh, actually, I put it here. So, cause and effect. So, this is kind of like a philosophical argument that many philosophers, Imam al-Ghazali in particular, he talked about it in detail. I'll put it to you this way. There was a big debate about whether you can say that this cause is actually the cause of this effect. Meaning, let's say I have a match, right? I strike this match, and then I have a piece of paper. And that lit match burns the paper. You say the cause of that burning of this paper is the lit match, right? If you think about it rationally. But what the philosophers were talking about is that how can you say that that this is absolutely bound to happen? Meaning that what you are believing is actually a law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this law that this match is going to create fire. And that this fire, when it's put next to a piece of paper, that paper will burn. All of these are laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you decided to change the law, for example, let's say this match that's lit, instead of burning the paper, it now freezes the paper. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have done that. That would have been the law. And now you would say this is the cause and this is the effect. So in fact, the philosopher says, the real cause is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning He's causing everything to happen. So when in reality you are thinking about a cause and effect, it's not what you think is cause and effect. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is really the cause of all the effects. But what Rashid Rida is saying, and he quotes Imam al-Ghazali in this, he says, they denied that cause is necessary for effect as some kind of inevitable connection. Meaning that the cause and effect become gods on their own. They naturally will have to cause these things, right? Meaning that you've eliminated Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the picture. This is what the philosophers objected to. They said these causes and these effects are by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. They're not just sort of inevitable. But it doesn't mean that they don't exist as observations for science. Do you understand this point? Does it make sense? Anybody have...
Some of the Muslim scholars, in fact, got deep into this with the verse, وَاللَّهُ خَلَقَكُمْ وَمَا تَعْمَلُونَ. Yeah, so there was this big debate during the time of the Abbasid, when the Muslims were relaxed, there was, too many publications and discussion and studying the Greek philosophies, and they got into some of these arguments, borrowing it exactly from the Greeks. But now they start looking at the Quran to justify which side they will side with the Greeks, because the Greeks were fighting intellectually, and some of the Muslims took this side, some of us took this side, and they start searching. That's where the ayah came, وَاللَّهُ خَلَقَكُمْ وَمَا تَعْمَلُونَ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you and whatever you are doing. And they start taking this verse to the extent of what Hassan, Allah Azil Khair, is saying. So, yeah, this is not a new issue.
No, so this is an old issue. But the Christians brought it up because they said, you Muslims are irrational. You don't believe in cause and effect, and science believes in cause and effect. But he's trying to explain to them this is a philosophical debate. It has nothing to do with the rational sciences about cause and effect. And he said, the reason why this was important, he says that you make this complaint that God cannot alter this cause and effect. And by that, if you believe that rationally, then you don't believe in miracles, Because what miracle does is it abandons or destroys this link between cause and effect. The fire does not burn Ibrahim alayhi salam. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cuts off the link between cause and effect. Because these are His rules. He has created these rules of cause and effect. Do you understand? Yeah, so he's saying that when you believe so stringently that cause and effect can never be severed, then you deny miracles. And in fact, there's a whole segment of Muslims today they're totally denying miracles altogether, and they spend all their time about this. Oh, well, this verse of the Quran. The reason why this is not a miracle because this is another explanation, and this is how it could be done, and that's why it's not a miracle. And then this doesn't mean that he put the pieces of the bird on every mountain. It means this thing and this. So they spend all their time denying miracles. He said that basically Islam the scholars of philosophy never denied miracles because they believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the cause of all these things, and He can sever that whenever He wishes. There's a few quotes that I just wanted to read in full because they kind of explain this in more detail. Sheikh Muhammad Abduh, he said that, this is his quote. He said, God sent down two books, one created, which is nature, one revealed, which is the Quran. These books cannot contradict one another. If there is an apparent contradiction, then the Quran must be interpreted metaphorically, meaning ta'wil, to make it agree with the findings of natural science. This was his point of view. Meaning that if you find something to be true by reason, by science, then that also came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because after all, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created science, He created reason, He created all these things. And if it's absolutely a scientific fact, and you find that the apparent meaning of a verse is in contradiction, then that apparent meaning should be interpreted in an allegorical fashion, using ta'wil. He's not coming up with this on his own, because he's actually quoting Imam al-Razi in his opinion, because this is what Imam al-Razi said. He said, verily it has been established when a contradiction occurs between rationally determined, between what is rational and what is the apparent meaning of a verse. And both are believed, but there's a contradiction. You can't believe both when there's a total contradiction because you're believing two opposites. So either the rational has to be determined false, and then the apparent, the apparent meaning of the verse has to be believed. But then this would necessitate resorting to contesting rational evidence, which is how we establish belief in the first place. So if you're going to say that revelation is countering rationality, then you're also destroying rationality, which is the basis of believing in revelation. So he said you can't really use that tactic. So he said that the only tactic left is that So thus it remains only to the veracity of rational evidence and correlate the transmitted evidence with it through allegorical interpretation. So he said that basically, in order to make these two things agree, you should resort to allegorical interpretation in that circumstance. And Ibn Rushd also had the same viewpoint. He said Muslims are unanimous in holding that it is not obligatory either to take all of the ayat in their apparent meaning or to extend all of them to allegory. He said that we're not compelled to do both. Like, you can't say that you're always meant to take the apparent meaning or you're always meant to do the allegory meaning. In fact, there are Sufi tafsirs, you read them, they're all allegory. They're not apparent meaning. The apparent meaning is this, the allegory is this. Yeah. So he said that's erroneous. Also, he said the dhahiriya, where you just take the apparent meaning in every circumstance and you avoid any kind of allegory. Also, he said this is a form of error because it cannot always hold up to scrutiny. So this is what he was saying, and he said, he quoted, meaning now Sheikh Rida, that the philosophers, because he was a defender of philosophers in many ways, and he said that they never believed that you should contest miracles. In fact, he said the ancient philosophers did not discuss the problem of miracles since they believed these things could not be examined or questioned because they are usul ad-din, they are principles of deen. In other words, there's no rational way of contesting a miracle because it is a pillar of deen, so you move on to things that are contestable by reason. And these are things that the human mind cannot attain. They're beyond the capacity of human beings. Yeah. Lastly, civil authority and Sharia. He said that this, and this I'll finish, this is the last slide. He said the claims of religious authority being agitators of fanaticism, birthplace of hatred, enmity between neighbors and friends, obstacles of equality of rights between people of the same nationality, shackles by will and power are suppressed, ways by which reason and thought are imprisoned. He says, it's true that this is religious authority and what happens to it if it's Christians saying this about Christianity, because this is exactly what happened with Christianity. And he said Islam had a totally different trajectory. In fact, when Islam came, it illuminated people's intellect and created a renaissance of intellectualism. He said man is God's slave in Islam, but free in relation to anything other than God. And the Prophet was, again, he was saying, is a conveyor of a message, and he was not a compeller. So he's saying that when, going back to the original criticism of the Sharia being a sort of a compulsion, and it destroys the reason, and it destroys civil society, and so forth. He said all that is true about Christianity and Christian belief, and it's been proven over time, but about Islam, in fact, the opposite is true. And he reiterated that here. So I think that's all the time we have. The book is worthwhile. I mean, it has much more than this. I didn't go into every detail.
We have 7 minutes for questions.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. I was going to end my part, and we have some time for questions or any comments, if anybody has any comments about this.
Questions, comments? Let me start with one. What was the motivation for Professor Simon Wood to translate the book?
I think he was trying to connect Islam with modernity, and in fact, he wanted, he thought that it would be of interest to people to see, how does Islam deal with modernity, and in fact, this is one of the earlier attempts to reconcile Islam and modernity. So that was why I think he was interested in it. Yeah.
Questions? Comments?
In addition to the French constitution, what was really also happening at that time with nationalism? Because nationalism did not exist before that.
Yeah. Yeah, so rise of nationalism. So the Constitution itself creates the idea of a citizen. So it comes from the Constitution as well. So I mean, they're kind of connected, but yeah, exactly. They had, in fact, that was the Ottomans then adopted this idea of citizenship and so on and so forth. It became influential everywhere. Yeah.
There's a book by Kaplan. It's called The Arabists. Basically, he talked, of course, what they mean by the Arabist, the U.S. diplomat within the State Department who are sympathizing with the causes of the Muslims in this effect, not just the Arabs. But when he talks about the Arabs in that book, he says, we proudly say that we have, made the Arabs proud of their culture, meaning Islam, of their deen, of their language. He said at the time that the French and the British were teaching the Arabs to spit on their culture. Because as we know, the Kuffar established in the Muslim land 3 main Kufr institutions. The American University of Cairo and Beirut, and then of Turkey later on, the Jesuits College in Lebanon, and the Victoria, which is for the French, and the Victoria College in Egypt, which graduated the kings and the princes. So he said while the Jesuit College and the Victoria College were teaching the Arabs to reject their culture, meaning Islam, and reject their identity and this and that, we proudly were telling them to be proud of who they are and their nationality. So, if you read it, it's clear. And those people who studied at the American University of Beirut, Constantine Zreiks and others, were the Arabin, the main people who were taking this nationalistic thing. But about the Bible, there was an interesting news about 10 years ago that South African ministers met together to discuss a law to ban books with obscenity. That there are books that have obscenities, and they will need to put a law to ban them. And after a long discussion, one of the guys said, by the way, if you put this as a law, we have to ban the Bible. Because as Brother Hassan mentioned, there are too many things in there about the stories of the Prophet that really it's beyond belief that Allah would release or give a prophet a status with all these things. But it's very interesting. I mean that Sheikh Rashid Rida at the time thought the need, after hesitating, to address those issues. And you could see he's not responding superficially. I mean, he studied this deeply, and the response come from that perspective. Any final words?
No, just one final word. I think the motivation, I didn't really mention this, but he thought the Christians will never be successful in turning us into Christians. He said that what he thinks they will be successful is turning us into leaving the deen and becoming people who just do every fahisha and become libertines. In other words, people who don't value their deen and lose faith and lose interest in Islam and become secularized. I mean, this is what was his main worry, and that's why he decided to respond. But he said, I never believed that we become Christians, because no Muslim, once they've had the rational belief they had, could go to this irrational belief and start believing in it. Yeah, well, there's many other things he did.
جزاكم الله خير وبارك الله فيكم. سبحانك اللهم بحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.